Ready? Don't get too excited about it. Yeah. I guess we're ready. Everybody hold your hands up if you're ready for this. We got one in the back here, not quite ready yet.
Notice that none of us held our hands up.
Yeah, we're not ready yet. Anyway, the next panel is us, and we are here to discuss the Kingpin project. The Kingpin project is a remake or a going into the actual production of Capcom's original Kingpin pinball machine. It's going to be done with the thought or with the determination to bring it into the modern day. We're honored to have Stan, who was the original artist on the game, with us here today, along with Paul and Jimmy.
And Animal.
And Animal. Animal, he's pretty shy and quiet, so you don't hear a whole lot from him. Anyway, Stan did the original artwork on it. Mark Ritchie did the original design on the game, and we were working, if you're not familiar, the three of us make up the Circus Maximus group, which we started out working with Python Angelo on the Python Angelo's or Python's Pinball Circus. And while we were working on that, Mark Ritchie approached us and told us that if we were interested in doing the Kingpin, that he would actually assist us and be part of it. And at that time, we really hadn't even considered doing Kingpin. But then we did. But we were really busy with the circus, and
It took us about 3 years before we circled back to actually start working on Kingpin.
Yeah.
From that time.
And there was a catalyst behind that last expo. We were approached by a good friend, Steve Sabota, and he said that if we came out to California to his house, we could have access to his Kingpin. And because of that, it cleared a hurdle that we needed, in that Kingpin has some game-specific parts that we didn't have drawings for, that we were not going to be able to really easily recreate without getting inside one of the games. He gave us unfeathered access to that game for an entire day. Steve Sabota is one of the greatest people you'd ever meet. He let us take apart a $60,000 game right there at his house, and we had it strewn out all over his game room.
Yeah, all of these other rare games that he has had parts of Kingpin on top of them with protection above it. But he went out to pick up some supplies for dinner, and he came back, and the game was completely disassembled. And of course, James and Jimmy and I are kind of playing it up, going, "What is this? Where did this go?" And making, but we were like any good Boy Scout. We left the game better than we found it. Fixed things that were broken, cleaned it.
Got it running actually much better, and really it was when we put his game back together. When we talked to Mark, we had never really had access to play the game. We'd seen reviews online about it, that people liked it. The only game that I got to play before that was Randy Peck's game, and his game played slow, but we found out, had not been shopped out, had been played. But once we played Steve's game, once we shopped it out, got it back together, we found that it played exceptional. And the relief there was, we realized we did not have to tweak the layout of that game at all in order to bring it up to be a great playing pinball machine. Mark did a great job on the design of that. So it was and with Steve, he gave us, or had some original parts that allowed us to build that first prototype that we have here at the show in 2.5 months. But going into it, we wanted to include Stan and use Stan's artwork We also had looked at Dave Christensen to do a limited edition artwork on it, but we've sort of shelved that for now. Stan's artwork is going to be on the game, and we always had the intentions of keeping everything as close to the original as we could. Where it's going to change is going to be in some of the things Paul and Jimmy over here is the programmer, so he's going to be doing, if you want to talk a little bit about what you're going to do with it, we got a little bit of time.
Oh, boy.
So the gist of how we're going to respect the original game and keep it very similar, and also bring it into, if the game was built today, how might it have been built slightly different, is when you own the game, when you turn the game on, you'll have the ability to play the original ROMs, or we'll call it the classic version, or you're going to be able to play an updated version. If you've played the game, you notice it's got a big LCD on it, and there was a reason behind that. When we started it originally, we thought we were going to go down the custom code path with new graphics before we went back into the emulation side. But with Jimmy being the Jedi Master that he is, he was able to knock out, you can talk about the emulation here in a minute, but when you turn the game on, you'll be able to pick classic mode or the new version, which takes full advantage of that screen like any new Spooky or Stern game would, with new graphics and animations for it. Some of the other slight tweaks we're going to do to it is we're working with Back Alley Creations to kind of make some of the areas a little more 3D. So the slingshots, they're actually barrels and crates. They're going to actually be 3D barrels and crates. The building in the back is going to be a fully sculpted Hotel Lex, and possibly some other buildings down the side. So that should help it feel more like a game that was released today with some of those slight modifications to it. And Jimmy can talk a little bit about the emulation side of things and how we ended up down that path, and that's what you're playing today on that screen is the emulated 1996 ROMs.
Yeah, so Capcom Pinball, I think they went under around, was it 95?
96.
Or 96? 96? Yeah, so basically they had their own hardware system that all of their games used, and a lot of the ASICs, or basically the chips that are on that board, are no longer produced. And there are a set of chips on that board that whose contents actually can't be extracted. They actually basically burn a fuse inside of that FPGA that's on the board. So we were basically dealing with a black box, right? And that's really difficult whenever you say that, all right, we need to make X number of these things in the future. One of those boards on the spare parts market is like $500. They're very hard to come by.
And that's the reason why Gene only could make about 200 Big Bang bars, is he used original hardware. We're actually using a P-Rock based system, which has become very common in recent production games.
Correct. Yeah. So most of the newer manufacturers you see, Spooky, American Pinball, Multimorphic, us, are using these P-Rock boards. And so basically what we had to do was make software that's designed to run on a Motorola 68000 based processor, that's 64K of RAM, talk to a new hardware system. So effectively that left some challenges to be had in the emulation, because everything, when you're dealing with emulation, things only have about a few milliseconds of play. You don't really have a lot of slop there in terms of what you can pull off. So that was kind of interesting. It took us probably about 4 weeks or so to get the emulation package kind of working to what you see.
Now Jimmy's based in Austin.
I'm in Austin, yeah, and all of these guys are in Atlanta. So the game is actually
Stan,
except for Stan, but the game's in Atlanta and I'm in Austin. So basically, what we would do is FaceTime, and effectively Paul would set the cell phone between the flippers, and I would basically be remote desktoped into the game and pushing code across. And effectively be, asking Paul, okay, well, do you smell smoke yet, or is there a fire yet? Is it blinking properly? And then usually, Paul's down in the basement, so his Wi-Fi's not so good. So most of our time wasn't actually spent programming the game; it was usually spent fighting issues with, FaceTime. So
froze or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And so that was quite a bit of fun. There's still a lot of tweaking to do on the emulation side. But we want to respect the original game. We actually think the software that's on the original game is quite fun, but obviously there will be a complete refresh, and when you turn the game on, you will potentially have the option to play the new software or the old software as it was originally intended. So, but that's kind of where we're at with the emulation. So, we're going to be adding in some new features and things like that, even in the emulated package, kind of surrounding the Hotel Lex and things like that. But yeah, it's been a really fun puzzle to solve in terms of getting all that hardware working and stuff like that. But ultimately, it's good.
So that basically gives you a background of what, just a brief background of what we are doing with the game that's out there, and what we, a little bit about what we want to go forward with. With Stan, what the three of us are actually curious about, and I don't think we've ever had an in-depth conversation with him about the history of how the artwork came about, and his history with Capcom. He also, if you're familiar, did the Big Bang Bar artwork and the Break Shot artwork, which were the three best designed games, I think, at Capcom. Some people like Pinball Magic a little bit, but those are the three games I actually like the most. The artwork was a good reason that those three games, I think, were the best ones. So anyway, with Stan, you came to, we were talking a little bit earlier, you came over from Sega?
Right. So my history in video games, which was very limited. I started on the early old Amiga systems. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, at Incredible Technologies, mainly doing redemption games. But they had a slow down in their licensing and production, so I was one of the casualties that got laid off. But that was my first exposure to kind of sitting in front of a computer working. It was a great opportunity to learn on the job. So I went out of my way to pursue other computer art jobs, and so I went to Sunsoft. A lot of people that were laid off at Incredible Technologies went to Sunsoft, and they were run by, names escape me quite quickly. But I was only there for a year. They went under, and Sega picked up the crew there. Sega had many different development locations, and this one was in Northbrook, Illinois, a northern suburb. The issue with Sega, it was one of the top publishers at the time, but their main issue was that they were developing 4 or 5 different platforms. And unfortunately, the group that we were in, we were developing on the platform that they were going to drop. So after a year and a half, we all got the boot. And headhunters kind of swarmed over us, and I was sent out to interview at Sega in California, which I went out there, but I'm thinking, well, it's going to be the same thing all over again because the issues haven't changed. So the headhunters were sending me all over at California and Las Vegas. And so I remember coming back from an interview, and I got several offers, but I was still pretty hesitant on moving out there. So I'm in the hotel lobby, and I'm calling my headhunter. I go, is there anything else out there closer to home, Chicago? He says, well, there's a company out in Arlington Heights, Capcom. I go, Arlington Heights? What am I doing out here? Give me an interview. And at the time, they were looking at they just started up there doing pinball, but they wanted to keep a video presence, and they had a small team working on video, and I said, that's perfect, that's what I want to do, because I want to keep doing the computer graphics stuff. So they hired me on, working on the video game for half a year, if that, and it wasn't going anywhere. We were still in early pre-production I didn't see any sign of advancing forward. So I was approached by a new designer from Williams that came over, Rob Morrison. He goes, we can all see you're a little frustrated. Do you want to come over and work on a project with me? They're giving me a game, and I don't really know what to do with it yet. You want to help me out? I said, that sounds great. So all he had was a mechanical arm that he wanted to incorporate on the play field. He said that would be great for like a space exploration game. I said, okay, so they just kind of like threw me in an office and kind of just let me concept different ideas for them. Came up with 15, 20 different concepts, brainstormed. It was a really great collaborative effort there. Everyone was very supportive, and they all, kind of threw out ideas. And one of the first things we determined that an exploration game, using the arm was cool, but the actual theme we thought was a little dry. So what do we do? And someone threw out, I'm not quite sure, remember who it was, well, what about if we do a space bar theme like they had in Star Wars? Oh, so you got science fiction, you got drinking, you got pinball, and so okay. So I went off and running on that, came up with 4 or 5 different layouts. Basically, when I say layouts, I'm thinking the translate artwork and the characters that would fall in there. And there was one where I did kind of like an outdoor space patio bar thing. And in the background, I had these tube dancers. And Python Angelo, who was mentioned earlier, great guy, he was our creative director, and he just kind of like let me alone, like just do what you do. And he goes, that should be a feature on the game. That would be great. And from that, then we kind of finalized what we want to do, and then it was just a matter of me tweaking the layout of that translate, and then the playfield just kind of like fell into place.
So while Break Shout came out first, you actually worked on Big Bang Bar first.
I was working on Big Bang Bar, and then Mike Stroh, who was the president of the company, saw that there was a lot of competition out there for these complex games. So let's get in the market on a low-cost retro game that Greg Kamick was kind of playing around with. And it was going to be a pool game. Pool is kind of a classic theme for pinball. And he says, well, we want to rush this game out there. So Stan, why don't you drop Big Bang Bar, go over to what turned out to be Break Shot. But then it wasn't Break Shot, it was a pool game, but Python thought it'd be great to have the theme would be the Greek gods playing pool with the planets. So I was fine with that because it was a tight deadline, kind of had it, so I didn't have time to really work out and flesh out everything as much as I wanted to. So I came up with a couple quick pencil layouts, had a big board meeting late at night. All these meetings always seem to happen late at night. And there was an account person that kind of reasons. So a lot of these games end up in bars. Are the patrons of bars in the South going to know what the Greek gods are? And I'm looking at it, I'm like, wait a minute, we had little mini milestones along the way. No one says anything, it's okay. So we had to shift gears. I had to come up with what ended up being Break Shot, kind of a yuppie Miller Lite commercial type look, like literally the next day. So to kind of make up time, I thought, okay, well, this is a retro game, and all the translights back then were silk-screened, very simple line art, flat colors. So that was a great way to cut time to and it would still fit in with the style of the game, and everyone seemed to like it. It was great. So then I got pushed back onto Big Bang Bar. I was wrapping up Big Bang Bar. Meanwhile, in the next space next to me, Mark's gangster game was going along. And all I saw was this turnstile of artists that coming and going. No one seemed to be able to fulfill Mark's vision of what it was. I don't know if Mark knew what it was. It was kind of like he'll know it when he sees it. So when the last artist was let go, I'm still kind of finishing up Big Bang Bar, and Mark comes to me, "You want to work on this game?" And I'm thinking, well, I kind of want a little more job security here. I don't know if I want to do this.
When you started on Big Bang or on Kingpin, Break Shot was complete at that time?
Just about complete, yeah. It was, essentially it was complete.
Who came up with the title Big Bang Bar? Do you recall that?
That again that came out of a brainstorm meeting. Because I think Planet Mars was like the first working title. But then there was a lot of political intrigue going on at the time because a lot of the workers there had come from Williams, and so there was a lot of
There was a lawsuit, I believe, at that time between Williams and Capcom.
Right.
Yeah.
I wasn't privy to any of this because I was still basically an outsider. I didn't really know the ins and outs of what was going on there, but all I knew there was issues. And there were accusations of people being moles and, giving inside information back to Williams what we were doing, and because they had all the distributors tied up, and Capcom got the leftovers. So all they had to do was find out if we were working on a Magic game, they had a full production team and everything. They get a Magic game out there, and
Yeah, if I remember.
you don't want two Magic games out there, so they're going to take the first one. Same thing with our space game. All they knew was we were working on a space game, so all of a sudden we see Attack from Mars coming out. So that's just the nature of the beast. You deal with that, and you just hope that you can make a good enough game that they'll still want our game anyways. So
Was there a gangster game that came out before Kingpin that would have been along that lines?
Yeah.
It could have been Whodunit.
Whodunit was
I was
right at
wondering
that
if
time.
what Williams was going to respond to Kingpin with would have been interesting. How did the art process work with Kingpin or even any of the games? Were you also involved with helping with the dots, or were those entirely separate?
Well, with both games, I would, when asked, because I didn't want to step on any toes, if they needed help with character designs or storyboarding it out, then I would help. And I was approached a couple times, but I would say that for Big Bang Bar, my input was minimal, and it was more evident in Kingpin, but there again, they could have done without my input, and it would have been just fine.
How did the playfield artwork? I'm assuming Mark would have given you a CAD diagram, and then would you draw?
Right,
on top of it, or-
with all the games, I would get the CAD diagram, and when I start there, I told you my motivation was to stay in video. So when I was shifted over to pinball, my first question was, well, can I generate the artwork on a computer? And they said, you know how much gigabytes of memory that would require? At least a gig, We're talking about a $1 million game or something. And so obviously that was out. So everything was done traditionally, and everything, so like for the translights, I did it like 1.5 times the size. So and the same thing with the cabinets and everything. So all the original art was pretty huge, and thankfully there were large flatbed scanners and stuff. But
Was the reason behind doing it extra large is so that when it was reduced?
well, that was my idea. Yeah, especially for the translates. In publishing, that's what they often do is when you reduce something, it kind of tightens it up, and so.
When you were working with Mark on that, the playfield art specifically, because obviously the playfield art has to tie into the rule set.
Right. We worked very closely on that. When I say we worked on it, he's basically dictating what he'd like to see, and that's basically.
So would he come up with when I say he, Mark, or the programmer, who was the programmer? That was
Tony DeFeo.
DeFeo. Futz and Rotor didn't
So this Futz is there's a photo of that I showed. Stan didn't remember this photo, so it was kind of fun watching him see it for the first time in a while. Was the Kingpin with Mark Ritchie, Chris Granner, Stan, and Futz was next to it. So we originally thought Futz was very involved. His name's in the credits. And so when Jimmy and I had some questions regarding some timings with Hotel Lex and all that, I reached out to Futz, and it turns out that he basically took over maintenance of the code after Tony, and I'm guessing a lot of the team was already laid off as Capcom was starting the closing process. But I've always thought it would be fun to get those 4 people again around the new Kingpin when it rolls off the assembly line and get a brand new photo with all of that. But yeah, it was fun. Tony DeFeo.
Tony DeFeo, yeah, that's what I was
It was really fun working with Mark. Since like I said before, he didn't know what he wanted, but he knew it when he saw it. So that kind of pushed me, and we went through a lot of layouts, and it's just like it made for a better finished product because we were able to think it through together. So,
how long of a process was the art for Kingpin? Was it 3 months, 6 months?
well, once the designs were finalized, really not that long. The longest part is the playfield because, we're kind of working hand in hand from the beginning, so when shots change, the artwork changes. So, in retrospect, it would have been much easier to do it on the computer because then you can just, yeah.
Do you still have any of the iterations of the earlier artwork, or as it changed? Do you still
Well,
have
the earlier artwork it would be totally different than what you see now. Different theming. It was all based on Capone in the Prohibition era, but it's not like an arm shifted or heads were moved, and it was totally different. And I'm not sure if I have any of that left, but
which came first? Translate, playfield, cabinet. What was the sequence?
for me, the translate was always first because in that the playfield was on the. I'm not sure how other companies work, but that was always the last thing that got finalized. So I was able to finish the translate in the cabinet first.
How far do you feel the game got? I know you weren't part of the programming or any of that. At what point did you leave, or as Capcom was basically?
I was still there when it was when the test games rolled off the assembly line. I don't know if you know the history of how Capcom went down, but before I started working at Kingpin, I was still in Big Bang Bar. Games went out to test, and it just kind of blew off the roof. And there was huge word of mouth globally. All people knew outside the country was, what's this Big Bang Bar? We hear so much about it. But internally, Python was pushing the soccer game,
The flipper football.
Mm-hmm. And they brought in distributors from Europe, to showcase the game, and they brought them into sound studios and had them do the voices for the cheering and everything. So they were wine and dine, and they were sold. They promised to commit to so many purchases, and when that rolled off, none of those purchases came through. And meanwhile, Big Bang Bar and Kingpin were kind of sitting on the sidelines, and that's basically when the plug was pulled.
But overall, internally, Kingpin and Big Bang Bar were essentially considered complete for the most part.
Yeah,
Near completion.
yeah.
Do you recall how many Big Bang Bars and Kingpin prototypes or samples, whichever you want
I
to
think they were about the same, like 11 or 12, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the debates that goes around, is how many Kingpins
Still
were made
exist.
and how many still exist. And I believe now the number is 9.
So we think there was 9. One of them got lost in a fire, along with, I believe, there was a Big Bang Bar original one where it was lost in a collector's fire. So we think the game we built is either number 9 or number 10 that still exists at this point.
Yeah, but there can always be one stuffed away. Going back to the Pinball Circus, there was always the rumor there was a third game that went over to Europe and it got lost over there somehow. And as it turns out, if a game did go over to Europe, it came back. The only 2 games that existed before our Whitewood on the Circus was the one that's at the Pinball Hall of Fame in Las Vegas, and the other is at Ken Fidesda's house, who was an executive with Williams. So we were able to track that down. But Kingpin still, there's a little floating, and I believe Mark also confirmed what you were saying. There was 10 or 11, 12, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Well, I probably heard those numbers from Mark, so.
We believe that what they would do is order, let's say, 25 sets of ramps and 25 play fields, and they'd order more parts than the 10 that they were building. And part of the reason they'd order more was a set of them is they needed to make sure that the manufacturer adhered to the engineering specs for these parts. So what we found while working on Kingpin was that we would, while there were 9-ish games that existed, every now and then you'd find some original parts. You'd find an NOS playfield, or you'd find some wire forms, or a ramp. And we're lucky in this case that James actually, before we even decided to work on this project, had the original ramp tool, the vacuum forming tool for Kingpin.
The original tool for the plastic ramps, there's 2 plastic ramps on the Kingpin, and the original tooling ended up with Illinois Pinball. If we want to go back, what happened after Capcom closed, essentially all the assets of Capcom Pinball went from Chicago out to California and sat in a warehouse. And then Gene Cunningham went out there, Gene Cunningham of Illinois Pinball went out there and basically bought it off the back dock. And he also had, and I don't know if it was part of that purchase or he got it elsewhere, he had an original Big Bang Bar. But Gene ended up with basically the remnants of what was Capcom Pinball. And it turned out in those remnants was the original tooling for both the Big Bang Bar and Kingpin. And then in 2009, when I purchased the assets from Illinois Pinball, I was able to get the original Kingpin and Big Bang Bar tooling. So that is quite valuable. We also, when I purchased the assets from Gene Cunningham, ended up with, when Gene bought the stuff from Capcom, there was boxes, probably 20 to 30 boxes of Capcom CAD printouts. Never did find the actual CAD files, computer CAD files, but they printed out everything and put them in hard files. And so I ended up with that, which has also been a huge help putting Kingpin together because we found some of the original Kingpin CAD file prints, along with the standard, the generic Capcom parts. So that's been a huge help. And then
Mark gave us a PDF.
yeah, Mark had a PDF of the original CAD, playfield CAD. That was the good news. The bad news, in a way, well, it's not bad news. The obstacle that we have with it is it's a fully populated CAD PDF.
So everything above the playfield, on the playfield, and below the playfield is all sandwiched together in one PDF file, and you can't turn layers on and off. So,
So we have to, we're having to go in and manually strip the layers off of it. We still have to finish an XY of that playfield, the blank playfield. Fortunately, we do have scans of not a populated, but a playfield with the artwork on it, and we'll be able to extract a lot of the XY off of it. So it's what our next step with the game ourselves. We are now coming up with the BOM, the bill of materials for it, and that is some people, you look at a pinball machine and you lift it up and you see parts, and until you take every screw, nut, bolt, wire, switch, washer off of that, you don't have a real appreciation of how much is inside a pinball machine. Gary Stearns is always, in his speeches, and many of them, has said there's 3,000 parts inside a pinball machine. He is not lying. There are that many parts in a pinball machine. Fortunately, a lot of them are generic, off-the-shelf kind of washers, those things. Kingpin, like any other game, has game-specific mechanisms. So we have to, in order to create a BOM, you have to have engineered drawings of each part, not the assemblies. You've got to have down to the breakdown to the individual engineer, the specs of each individual part that make up the assemblies. So we're having to do that, and in order, the reason you have to do that is you've got to send those drawings out to vendors and get quotes on what it's going to cost to build whatever quantity, 250, 500, whatever the quantity breakdowns are. And that's a lengthy process. The other lengthy process is the guy at the end of down there, the software part of it, which Jimmy is stone-faced going, yeah, thanks on that. So that's where we're at with going forward with it. Production-wise, we started out with the intent of doing the production in-house. And we purchased a building in Aiken, South Carolina, and that was purchased when we were still working on the Circus before we got into the Kingpin. And we were looking at setting up production. And that production would be very parallel to the production scale that Spooky started out with. Since then, we've looked at other options such as getting assemblies made outside and doing the final assembly in-house, and even all the way up to the point of a manufacturer taking our finished product and putting it on their production line. So we've got options in which way we want to take it. The reception of the game has been extremely well. Stan's artwork, Mark's layout, the original software is good. What we find with the original software is it's 1996, and 1996, it's a 128 by 32 display. So it's limited in the graphics. We have a large LCD display in it, and that's going to allow us to use HD type graphics. So getting back to what they were referring to is we want to keep the original software in there so people can play the classic version, which is what it is, the 1995, the mid-1990s version, but we also want to have a modern version software where we can take advantage of that full screen and have it bring the game into the modern era. There's also some things that we're going to do cosmetically. At this point, there is nothing that needs to be changed as far as the layout and the play of that game. If you've played it, it's a good playing game. Ours is it is a prototype, so it's not going to play as smooth as the one that Capcom did originally. It's our first prototype. But if you do play even our prototype, you're going to find it's a great playing game. And when we add the software packages to it, I think it's going to be a fantastic playing game. We add Stan's artwork, keep that in there, and there's nothing that needs to be changed that way. What we're going to do cosmetically, Paul has sort of been the spearhead on that, so I'll let him go over that.
I already kind of mentioned that with Back Alley a little bit, I believe.
Yeah.
So, with the buildings and all of that.
Yeah, did he mention that?
I'm pretty sure I mentioned that, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I missed it. I don't pay attention to them a whole lot. So, but the other part, did you mention the slot reel? What the plans there?
We alluded to it. So we're going to try. The slot reel right now is a DC motor that spins it with some opto interrupters on it, and that's been somewhat problematic in the emulation side. We're close. We're very, very, very close. But the thought being is, if it was done today, would they have done a DC motor? And no, the odds are they probably would have done a little LCD display on it. And the truth is, there's 5 main modes in the game in Kingpin, plus the kind of the wizard mode. And the only time that slot reel is really used for any purpose is one of the modes where you have to stop the slot or shoot the shot while it's stopped on a certain row. And so our thought is that Jimmy and I have been coming up with the idea of taking an LCD screen, replacing the reel with that. Now in the other modes, we can have gangsters walking by the window in the hotel, and often people are doing other interesting acts, or however PG rated we want to keep it or not. And then also still have that slot mode in there. So we've started down that path now, and are trying to pick out the right LCDs. We've tried a couple of them, and I don't know if you have anything else to add to that side. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
The other part about the software, which Dave alluded to, is we've talked about, it is going to have both packages. And what we've got to do there is keep in mind that we want the player to be able to choose which software they play, but also I've talked to operators, and operators just want people to walk up to a machine, put a coin in, push play. They don't want confusion before the game. So there'll be 2 settings. One setting will be that the player will choose which software gets played in the game. So most people in the home would probably leave it on the setting of being able to choose whenever they play it. Operator setting would be the operator sets it, it's predetermined, and when it's on a location, it's going to play one or the other if that's what the operator wants, which is probably what based on talking to the operators, that's what they would want more than anything, so that it's confusion in a location is something that will lose money. Stan, anything else you want to add on your side of it?
No, not really.
Paul, any questions then?
Al?
Yes.
I got a bunch of questions. I'll start with my first.
Sure.
Okay. When it came to a lot of the Capcom components, I remember that the game would tell you in the operator menu when lights were out because of voltage. Will your game have that feature, and what are the LEDs and this kind of thing in regards to that? Are you going to keep it incandescent LEDs and make that still work with LEDs? Go that route?
We're going to go with LEDs.
That game is LED that's
Yeah,
out there.
the one that we have out there is LED. As far as the Capcom, I've been in pinball since the early 80s. And when Capcom came along, I was absolutely impressed with their diagnostics, their software, everything about it. The gameplay, Capcom was, to me, a superior game than anything being made at that time. It's unfortunate that they were short-lived. As far as Jimmy, you can add to the, will we have the same diagnostics as far as the, we do we have it on the switches with the software that's in there? Do we have that tied in?
Yeah, so you'll get standard diagnostics. For example, if we don't have switch hits within so many, such and such a time, we can detect switch row outages. We can detect row shorts, things like that. We can detect those because actually on our game, all the switches are actually direct. So we can usually detect those. We will have an issue with the LEDs just because we do not have the detection circuitry that they actually used on the original Capcom system. That's something that we can definitely look into adding if operations and distribution is requesting that. But right now, the game doesn't have that piece, which is, of course, a downer. But you will get all of the, so for example, since it is an emulation, you get all the other diagnostic features. And with the new system, the diagnostics menu will be just as comprehensive, if not more. So yeah, you'll get all that.
I have one other question.
Sure.
And this is for Stan. So we're there the whole time. Can you tell us anything about Zingy Bingy? Was that real?
I broke Zingy Bingy.
It Zingy Bingy, yes, but Stan, if you got something
It was
about
there, but I was too busy on the 2 or 3 projects I was working on that I would walk by Python's office and see it, and that was the extent of my exposure to it.
James and I have played it.
I can give you a little bit more background on Zingy Bingy. Zingy Bingy was Brian Hansen and Python Angelo's project. And when I bought the archives from Gene Cunningham, there are production schedules, there are production meeting notes that I have that show Zingy Bingy. It was
It was treated as a serious project.
Yeah, it was a serious project. I think the designation on it was PB10.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, each Capcom machine had the model number PB 1, 2, 3, 4, up through 11. We've been able to track down, I believe, all but 8. There's 2 of them in there that we have not determined. One, PB1 was Pinball Magic. PB3 was Big Bang Bar. PB4 was Airborne. PB5 was Big Bang or Kingpin. 6 was Break Shot, and I think 7 and 8 were missing.
But Zingy Bingy did exist. It does
Yeah.
exist. It's in the hand of a private collector. When I say I broke it, James and I were playing it, and I was in the middle of playing it, and the coils just started freaking out. So I did what you're supposed to. You turn the game off. And when we turned it back on, it wouldn't come back on. And so I kind of had to tuck my tail between my legs. And luckily, after we got home from the trip, we talked to the collector, and he said the next day he turned it on, and the game was fine.
Yeah,
But
what ended up happening with the game is when Capcom closed, Brian and Python took the game with them. And ultimately, Brian sold it to the collector. And so it exists. It's very primitive.
Very rudimentary.
Yeah.
I think if you search on the internet, you will find pictures of it. It's not. I mean, it is interesting. I don't know. When we were working with Python on Pinball Circus, he had the vision of, you know what? I'm going to make it so every church in America wants a Zingy Bingy by making it an Adam and Eve pinball machine, by covering things with fig leaves and stuff like that. And
One of the last things, Python Angelo, unfortunately, sadly, passed away April 9th, 2014. And the last month and a half of his life, he was still working on the circus, but he was working on Zingy Bingy, turning it into Adam and Eve. And him and there's a video of him and I working together on it. It's probably 30, 45-minute video where we were going over ideas of what to do with the layout and how to convert it into game that a church would want instead of a brothel. So it was, I believe that was the last video taken of him and I cooperating with the game, with any game, whether it be Circus or Zingy Bangy. And it's really one of the most special videos I have. It's really cool, but he's drawing. So I have those sketches of what he was doing with it. So if you get my email, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send you photos of what we were doing, because it was cool stuff. So any other questions about, yes, sir?
Going back to the electronic system, I remember one of the things that they put in that system was that you could actually intentionally or mistake short the coil line into the switch matrix or the lamp matrix, and it did no damage to it. It was like a fuse that would cycle back and come back and come back up. I don't know if you can do that, whatever they did, that was beautiful.
I'm not familiar with that. Do you have any other details on it?
I know they demonstrated it at the AOA.
Are you referring to if there was an accidental short out between the two voltages that,
It wouldn't look.
like a Williams, it wouldn't become a toaster oven?
Yes.
The interesting thing about the P-Rock board system is it's very modular. So in our game, we have 4 switchboards. Each switchboard can handle 16 switches. We have 2 coil drivers, and each of those have 2 individual 8 banks that can be different. They're fused separately, different voltages. And so even if something like that would happen in ours, it would be isolated to an individual one of those boards, most likely, is the way I would describe it, correct?
That's correct, yeah. We minimized that risk, and I think what you're referring to is they did have, I actually have a test fixture of all the Capcom stuff for reverse engineering it, and yeah, I believe they do actually have a polyfuse across all of those to where it could reset, and it's a pretty low trigger depending on if it's switch voltage or coil voltage. It was a remarkable system to work on. Yeah.
I decided to start buying the games just for that.
Just for that.
One,
Are you saying you're clumsy when you work on games?
well, you got to remember there is an interlock switch in there that when you open up the coin door, then don't mess with it. quit fudging with that interlock. I know what you're doing. One other thing that our company, Circus Maximus, and even my company going back, Pinball Inc., which I didn't get into, never has taken pre-order money for anything, and we're not doing it on any of these projects. The only thing that we are doing is, as far as the Kingpin goes, is we have the translights that we offered. They're numbered 1 through 250, and Stan and Mark signed those translights. So you're buying a translight, but when you do buy that translight, the number that you have, that you get, holds that spot in line. As far as if we make 250 games and you have translate number 140, and when 140 comes off the line, or if people before you decide, the guys that have numbers below that pass.
It's a no obligation.
It's a sequential delivery based on the number of the translate. And we are now down to, I think we have under 20 remaining. That does not mean that we're only going to make 250 games. That's just reserving the first 250 for the people that get that translate. The translate itself is well worth it. Signed by both Stan and Mark. They are numbered, so we do have a couple of them here if you're wanting to pick one up. They're $149, which is what a translate sells for us these days. So there is that. And this guy over here is telling us we got to leave.
I was also going to make a suggestion to the audience.
Sure.
There's an insane amount of people like right out that door. So when you're exiting, I would recommend using these doors. You guys okay?
Well, why don't you just go on up, open those doors, let those people in first, and really create the chaos?
Maybe like that.
No, not me.
If you guys have any other questions, we have a booth in the vendor hall. Feel free to stop by, and we'll be glad to talk to you. All right. Thank you.